Hello, everyone. Our experts are ready to go, but we'd like to give participants just another moment or so to join us before we begin. Please hang tight and we'll begin shortly. Okay. Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining our webinar on technical debt in higher education. Today, we'll dive into this emerging topic and look to further define technical debt, its implications in higher ed, and explore the role that CFOs should play in proactively reducing tech debt. My name is Emily Brown, and I will introduce you to our panelists in one moment. Just a few notes before we jump in to what will surely be an informative discussion. Please take advantage of the Q&A options. Our panelists will address as many questions as possible today. We'll also reserve 10 minutes towards the end of the session for any remaining questions. Additionally, after the event, we'll share the on-demand version with you all next week. Please take a moment also to complete a brief survey at the end of the session. It'll take only about 30 seconds. It'll automatically pop up once you leave. And then, of course, if you have any technical difficulties during the event, please reach out to me via the Q&A feature, or you can email me via the email address I will put into the chat box. And with that, I would like to introduce our panel of experts. Our esteemed guests today include Amy Weiser, former SVP of Business Transformation at Laureate; Thomas Reams, EVP and CFO for Nightingale College; and from the Higher Digital team, we have Wayne Bouvier, co-founder and CEO, and Henry DeVries, VP of Finance and Analytics. Today's discussion will be facilitated by Joe Gottlieb, President of Higher Digital. And with that, Joe, please take it away.
Thanks, Emily, and welcome to everyone to our webinar today. We're really excited to have you on board for what we think is a really important emerging topic. And you might ask, why a webinar on tech debt? What is this all about? Well, tech debt, or technical debt formally, is a pretty sinister force that tends to accumulate with common practice and has a drag effect on progress that accumulates like compound interest. And so it's really important that we understand what it is, how to spot it, think about the implications it has and that drag effect. But then more importantly, how do we reverse the trend towards accumulating technical debt that's affecting our progress? And perhaps most importantly, how might we enlist the role of leadership, particularly CFOs, to help an organization to really understand this dramatic impact that tech debt is having, and ways of measuring it so that we can minimize it over time and therefore remove this drag effect that it has on progress, particularly in an increasingly digital world where technology is the platform upon which we're running our institutions, we're delivering education, we're delivering a student experience over an entire life cycle, and we're ultimately managing the back end of our institution that's required to sustain our operation. So with that, I'd like to dive right in, and we'll start out with a basic sort of definition. So Henry, take us through the context of what CFOs already have on their minds.
Sure, thanks, Joe. I think we're all familiar with the terms debt service and deferred maintenance. If you're a CFO, you understand that debt service really is money that's paid for availability of other funds. If we think of it in the home context, it's the interest you pay on a credit card or a car loan or a mortgage. If we have to acquire funds, it's usually not free, we have to pay for it. Deferred maintenance is a common term. It really refers to the fact that as an asset ages, and typically a physical asset like a building or a parking lot, we need to maintain it. And if we fail to maintain it, it gets worse and worse. A classic example is a driveway or a parking lot where asphalt has a couple of cracks, and the next year there's a few more cracks, and you think, well, I really get to this, and I don't get to it. And then within 3 or 4 years, it's reached the point that you have to replace it rather than repair it. So the longer you wait, put off the repair, the more it costs. And the idea of tech debt is an analog to that. Tech debt is really the deferred maintenance costs resulting from prior technology decisions. Sometimes we make decisions about technology and we think, oh, this is fine, no problem. But sometimes those decisions come back to haunt us, if you will, and repairing or remediating those earlier decisions takes time, energy, and resources. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do those come about? How do we deal with them?
So I would like to add in this note here in the yellow box, just that, as Henry was talking about that, right? Thinking about that parking lot example, really at the end of the day, you might be able to patch some cracks if you catch them early enough, but over the long life cycle of a parking lot, you're ultimately going to need to replace it with a certain fixed cost. And over the course of time, unless there's someone gets hurt tripping over a crack, that's a risk item, right? The parking lot is going to be pretty serviceable for what it does. The difference with tech debt is that you might introduce aspects of tech debt even in the way that you pave the parking lot. And so right from the get-go, you're introducing drag on your system and on your business processes in maybe ways that you deployed software or that you implemented a feature or that you rushed something out. And we'll talk about all these examples. And so the thing we want to highlight here is while we're hijacking or borrowing a known term that CFOs use every day or every week or every quarter, right? I want to accentuate the fact that this tech debt is even more sinister than the general deferred maintenance cost that we see in accounting. So let's look at some symptoms. You have tech debt when? Let's look at some of these different scenarios where tech debt is showing up. Big one is purchase software and SaaS, right? Where when we buy software, right, we're starting to see things that happen with software that we've purchased some period ago, right? When tech support issues take more time to resolve than they should. When we can't get the latest features on the version that we're running, or maybe we've been on the same version for so long that it's no longer even supported and we have to migrate. So let's talk about this one. I think this is one of the big trigger points and points of symptom where people will now recognize I've got a problem here because tech debt is slowing me down. So who from the panel would like to opine on this one? This is a big one. Wayne, I'm going to call on you. Let's talk about this one.
Thanks, Joe. I was waiting for others to join in. So yeah, stepping back and taking a look at this, right? In particular with software, it's not necessarily the software is incomplete, right? In many cases, most of the software, the vendors have been in the industry for quite a long time. These software has been deployed, scaled, so on and so forth. But ultimately, and this will be a theme that I kind of hit on throughout the rest of this webinar, but the root cause of this really is about through the organization. And in particular, what ends up happening is when IT is viewed as a services organization, right? Anybody within the institution can be empowered to say, hey, I need this unique feature, this capability, let's add it in here, right? And in the grand scheme of things, right, it's a couple days worth of work. What caused, right? Instead of, and this is really the lack of understanding or the long-term impact of it. So ultimately, the real problem here is around the organization. So, when you have technical debt and this is one of the main frustrations, that IT is not moving fast enough. These projects are taking too long. They go over budget. And a lot of times it has to do with the direct complexity of the underlying software for those reasons.
So you mentioned IT is not moving fast enough, right? I think that's oftentimes the understandable default perception, right? That IT is not moving fast enough. But when we look at a couple of these others, right, whether it's purchased or internally developed, right, the net effect here is that business users look to IT to make sure things are running swell. And they often don't think about the fact that they've been part of the reason we've gotten here, right? And we'll come back to some of the sort of ways to prevent this. We'll talk a lot about customization of software, but just lingering on these features here and some of the implications, right? If, let's say you're on a version that's no longer supported, because things are running slower and you haven't been able to keep up, And because you haven't been able, because you've maybe done a bunch of things, maybe there's customization involved where things are brittle and you haven't been able to move, right? What then happens is you can't take advantage of features of the next, or a fix that's available for people that are on the current software isn't available to you. And so what does this do? It basically slows down your business, right? You're stuck on previous functionality in a form that you've implemented, and it's getting harder and harder to keep running. So imagine that parking lot again, right? Cars are driving around cracks. Maybe they're afraid to park in your parking lot. What happens when people are afraid to park in your parking lot? They don't visit you. Well, does that have an impact on your business and the way it operates? And now people are walking to your facility from a distance. You get the point, right? So there are implications that then cascade throughout. What are the business impacts? If your system isn't evolving and flexing, right? If that's happening during during recruiting season, right? It could be affecting your ability to recruit new students and drive up enrollment. If it's affecting you during, a new term where you're trying to get folks, registered for classes, you can see the effects going on and on. There's another one in here, and that is obsolete hardware. So what happens when, if you don't keep your hardware up to date, what starts to happen? Can't run the software. Henry, this one I know you've talked a bit about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what happens is it takes more time to keep things running. Software continues to progress regardless of hardware. So a laptop that we'll keep it one more year. Well, suddenly you have to add a memory, and then one more year. Well, then you have to have a larger hard drive because the operating system is bigger. And so you end up investing funds into a laptop that's going to go away in a year. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources and planning. Might you be better off, rather than having old obsolete hardware to try and hang on to it, have a regular investment cycle so you can avoid all of those debts, those costs, those repairs to the parking lot to keep it serviceable.
Yeah, so to just play that out, we saw that with COVID, right? Where suddenly there was a surge in remote work, and then being able to get all these laptops that were now operating as remote workstations coming over, let's say VPNs from home with varieties of different bandwidth scenarios, right? Suddenly we had to typically run more software to do that well. And a lot of the laptops that were out there just weren't ready to do that. And so in retrospect, it would have been greater or nicer to have had a better understanding of where your hardware is, whether or not you were deferring maintenance, right? A la tech debt, right? Think back to that general term. And I bet a lot of institutions saw higher costs in the triage effort necessary to get remote workers up and running than what might have been possible with a more proactive stance with the state of their hardware. And even if the costs were the same, you can well imagine there was plenty of things to do, and rolling out new hardware or hardware upgrades or hardware supplements was just one more thing to add to the list that made things tricky.
Joe, it's Amy. I think one of the things is, and I'll skinny this down to a little bit easier than even how we've presented it. Anytime you are not running smoothly, anytime that you can't get your information out of your systems, you have debt. And it can be people, process, or the technology. If you need a continuous improvement loop, you need a continuous improvement strategy, and that gives you the ability to use bigger, better, stronger technology. And if you have that, things run smoothly. If you don't, if you've customized too much, you haven't upgraded when you want to move along and you want to buy a new piece of software, or you even want to improve on the processes that you have and you can't do it, you have tech debt.
Love it. Great ad, Amy. And, you make me think about the fact that what we didn't highlight in the slide here is at the data level, not being able to get access to data because you haven't necessarily thought about a data architecture each time you've added a new system.
That's right.
With the mindset of how am I going to help people do their jobs better and better and better with the right data at their fingertips, right? It ought to be an increasingly intelligent approach to how we use data. Well, that's another example of tech debt. The absence of a data architecture that allows people to keep getting the data they need is tech debt. Whereas the way to have, avoided that all along would be to say, we're always going to bring on new systems with an eye towards how they fit into the data architecture, so we continue to supply that data and in a holistic form for people to do their jobs. All right. let's move on to this next topic. So we talked about the symptoms. Now let's talk about the sources. And, I want to go through these, one at a time. We've alluded to this customizing purchase software scenario. And Wayne, I'd like you to talk us through this a little bit, because this one is, I think, the single biggest bad practice in all of technology, because two things are happening at once. We're going to the cloud, we're buying SaaS, which is smart, right? We no longer need to be in the business of building our own business applications. That's smart. But we're often bringing some of our old habits or even new habits to the way that we do it. Wayne, talk us about this, through this one.
Yeah, sure. So, this is the biggest proponent of technical debt. And as I mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, one of the main challenges here is, and in particular, and I'll define some of these, but, software that's on premise, right, versus the cloud. Joe, you just mentioned cloud software, right? We're, as an industry, and other industries are going through the same thing, where they're moving a lot of on-premise software into the cloud that's maintained by a third party. Typically, it's a software vendor. And ultimately, what is happening here is that, the human change, the human process that kind of underpins, whether it's recruiting, enrollment, financial aid, all the way through alumni, most of these processes and people have been around for a long time. And it ultimately, the kind of the naive view is that it's easier and cheaper to fix the software to adapt to our processes, which ultimately is not the case, right? And again, that's part of the reason why the technical debt is something that the industry needs to take much more seriously, need to be aware of, so on and so forth. And ultimately, this is an organizational challenge around why and how. Like, there's a governance aspect, right? Most institutions are very siloed. Budget is all over the place, really empowering even relatively junior managers to go to IT, telling them we need this specific widget, versus trying to change it. The other part to this is that I think it's important for institutions to really understand what's a competitive advantage, what is really unique, right? Because I think too often institutions think everything that they do is unique, all parts of the process, right? Again, thinking about the life cycle of a student as an example, right? Going from a recruiting prospect all the way through alumni. And, the reality is most of these software vendors are deployed at, thousands of institutions, certainly hundreds. And there's a commonality, and they do provide some configuration, but the approach to kind of pour concrete on top of the software to kind of make it more calcified is really, just because of your internal processes, is really one of the biggest challenges. And that's really one of the areas, the human change is one of the hardest areas for institutions to change.
Joe, let me just add one more thing to Wayne's comment, because as institutions add customization to software, every time the vendor provides a new update, a new release, a new patch, the existence of these previous customizations has an exponential impact on the testing that's required. And I have encountered more than one institution that have thrown their hands up and said, we physically cannot upgrade this anymore. We're 2, 3, 4 versions behind. We don't have the capacity to test all of the normal things that are delivered by the vendor, plus all of our own customizations. We have dug ourselves into the proverbial hole and we can't get out. The parking lot has collapsed and they're in a sinkhole, as it were.
Well, and you mentioned testing, and that's on the balls of your feet, maybe in the most benign scenario, right? But once, when you're not able to test, what happens is things break. And the cost to break, the cost to fix a broken integration, for example, that based upon triggered by an upgrade, is unpredictable. And so it really adds to the way that you might even follow through adopting a new implementation, a new version of software. So this obviously runs in, starts to become a bit of a vortex. And, we've even seen IT organizations get seduced by the notion of being valuable to their stakeholders by supporting them with customization. and they get, before you know it, they're in the game of saying yes, and they feel good about saying yes versus prescribing the medicine of saying no and saying we should not customize because it's only going to serve us temporarily. It may feel good at first. It may feel like we're doing the right business thing at first, but as Wayne said, let's use CRM, customer relationship management as an example. Who really has unique CRM processes at the end of the day, right? It's just not happening. Who really has some unique processes on the back end? The key is to make these systems stay current with current state-of-the-art functionality that these vendors are able to supply, and then make sure your teams and your processes are advancing their ability to be competitive as an institution utilizing these capabilities. So let's keep moving on. Shortcutting systems integrations. Wayne, quick one on this, just in terms of like the role of EA.
So one of the important and as strategic as well as tactical is really understanding the system, whatever system you're implementing, is going to require consistent integrations with other systems, especially if you need data reporting out of this, right? And the more standard you are, the healthier that you're going to be able to get the information out. Vice versa, if you're doing simple, basically back of the napkin type of integrations where it's really not well thought out of, maybe it's one particular IT person that's doing it, it's not documented, it just, all the risk starts to increase, right? Your entire ecosystem becomes very fragile as a result of all that.
Okay, Amy, I've got one in here for you. Specializing new system purchase development, let's say for a particular department. Here's another source.
So I think the big message is, in the past, IT was more a back office support. I would say to you right now that IT is one of your most strategic partners. Whether you are an operations person, whether you are a finance person, everybody needs to be in the room. Everybody needs to select new purchases, new technology together. It needs to have fluid integration. It needs to be easily adapted. You do not want to go put in technology and figure out the people in the process later. You've got to do it hand in glove all along, people, process, and technology. You need to define the business uses. Our students are working faster. Our faculty is working faster. Technology is improving faster. There has to be a strategy behind this, and you need to work together to get it done and go back to that continuous improvement loop.
Right on. Thank you, Amy. So I think we covered the hardware scenario pretty well. So I want to move on to our case study where Thomas, take us through Nightingale College. And you guys had some experience with tech debt that I think you're prepared to share with us today. But first, give us a little quick background on Nightingale College.
Sure, absolutely. This entire presentation has been preaching to the choir for me. Something that I had to deal with quite a bit as I came into this role. But Nightingale College, we're a proprietary distance education nursing college. We're based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. We actually have our 10-year anniversary this year, so we're really excited about that. Our focus is really on higher learning in healthcare to solve the nationwide nursing shortage. We have a shortage out there. We're trying to solve it. And we use evidence-based and data-driven approach that serves these diverse communities. So obviously, knowing that, we have we lean heavily on our IT and our systems, right? So we need to know what data is coming out, make sure it's good data. Enrollment is about 2,000 and growing. We're going to probably double that in the next year or so. We're growing significantly as a college. We have 350 collaborators. We call our employees collaborators. So it's a culture thing we do. And we have 500 clinical partners across the United States, so we work really closely with. Our model is unique. We educate the nursing student no matter where they live. So it's pretty much distance education. And then we fly them or have them drive into our partners for their clinical rotations. And this allows us to solve the rural nursing shortage, where that's where we see it mostly is in the rural or underserved communities, not necessarily in the metropolitan areas as much. And so we're able to solve that problem with our model, and even have our learners or students travel in to these partners where the partners can actually work with them and say, hey, we have a shortage. We'd love to have you come work for us, and gives them an opportunity to speak with nursing students they would probably not otherwise have.
Awesome. Okay, so given that background on Nightingale College, let's talk a bit about your experience with tech debt, starting with some old approaches. This is a then versus now story. So for anyone that was a little worried, Thomas has come out the other end for the most part. But bring us back to that earlier part of your history where you were dealing with some tech debt sources.
Yeah, so when we see this a lot, and I've seen it in other organizations that I've worked for and worked with. But a lot of the old approaches were isolated decision making by separate departments. We talked a little bit about that just barely, where you'll have an individual, maybe a junior manager, that would make a decision. They need a software, they need a solution. They wanted to enter into that for themselves to solve their problem, right? But it doesn't. You don't get a lot of synergies through that. So that we had a lot of different systems that had a little bit of redundancy and things like that. We use customizations as a process solution. Again, we talked about that a little bit earlier. We look at the software and say, hey, that's not the way we do it. Let's bring somebody in to fix it so it's our way, instead of looking at the process and saying, hey, maybe we should look to see if we can really kind of mold it more to the system itself. And the third one really is short-term technology plans were driven by yearly budget. So we looked at it on a yearly basis, right? And we didn't really look to, we had strategic plans into the future, but really IT itself was more of a, what can we afford this next year, right? And what can we do this next year, instead of really having an overarching plan. So that was kind of what we did in the past. The solutions were department specific. We were leading to software overlap. We had data isolated to each function or department. So it was really difficult. And we had a lot of features in our software that weren't turned on, stuff that we didn't utilize because it was specific for one area. And so we were paying a lot of money for a lot of things that we weren't using. So that was one of the issues with having that isolated decision making. The customizations break, we already talked a little bit about that. So not only do we have to go back through, like what Henry had mentioned, we have to go and make sure that we vet our customizations, make sure that they're working for the new release, but sometimes that customization just won't work with the new release, right? So there's many times where you kind of stick your flag in the past, and that's where you're stuck, because your customizations kind of tether you to a year or two in the past. So that's been difficult as far as what we're looking at. And then the last one is technology solutions become obsolete, and they don't allow for growth. And so we talked a little bit about that as well, to where the solutions that we had are ones that, we'd actually employ people around the problem instead of solving the tech problem. So there was a cost as far as personnel. And so, the technology couldn't do what we wanted to. So we did a lot of manual processes outside of the system. And obviously that opens you up to a lot of error. And when you have a lot of error, that opens you up to risk. And we don't, obviously CFOs, we don't like risk very much.
So you were actually having to employ personnel to staff inefficient or incomplete processes that were held back by the technology, in your mind, because of this cumulative tech debt. I think we see that a lot, right? I think we see a lot of institutions that wind up throwing labor at the problem because it's the one resource that in their minds is more fungible, but we all know that it makes up a big part of the budget, and we know that we have budget constraints. And so in this case, you were plugging holes with people, and that was affecting your ability to deploy people in perhaps more forward-looking, more growth-oriented opportunities for the college.
Absolutely. Yeah. And having throwing people at a problem is not scalable, right? And so it's something that you can't grow very quickly, and you're not dynamic with it. You have a lead time of training. People aren't effective on day one usually. And so there's a lot, you're just slow. If you have a system that does it for you, automations are very aligned to your processes, then you are much more efficient, and you actually can move forward. And again, we talked about being data-driven and evidence-based. That's hard to do when your data is not readily available, and it's not clean. You have processes that are outside of the system. So, it slows you down significantly.
So I think what Thomas is describing is really, really, really common, especially at higher ed. You either end up throwing people at it, which is expensive, as he's pointed out, or you end up buying more and more technology and trying to stack it on top of each other, and it even overlaps and you end up with more expense regardless. So your CFOs struggle the whole entire time because they're trying to plan their capital budget, and they're either throwing people at this, the institution is throwing people at the solution, or they're buying additional technology that they potentially don't need because they have that tech debt in the first place.
Wow, great point, Amy. And I think to broaden that example, to me that sounds a bit like buying features that might be showing up more elegantly as suites and probably from your existing vendor. But if you've painted yourself into a corner with one vendor and you examine and determine the fastest way to get this feature is yet another system, you're being tempted by this bad pattern, right? And so oftentimes if we ask that question, you bet the fastest way to get this feature, at least in theory, is to add yet another system. This is why we see these massively complex and unwieldy portfolios in the higher ed space. Higher ed doesn't have a monopoly on this, but we tend to see it a fair amount in higher ed.
I think the other thing that you start to see is, do you have different people, especially in higher ed, you have different people with different budgets. And so they sometimes, with the SaaS solutions, they don't always have to involve IT, because someone comes in and says, hey, this is great. You don't need to go to IT every single time you need something. It's a SaaS solution. You're going to be able to do this yourself. But that's another reason why your IT team is your strategic partner, is they need to go in and plan, how is this going to integrate with your other systems? How do you make sure that either if you're getting a better system, that you're retiring a system, going back to the tech debt, it might be time to retire a system, but throwing additional pieces of technology, throwing people at it, you're just going to start to create additional tech debt and a higher solution for your institution. And ultimately, you're going to slow down what you're providing for your students and your faculty.
Right.
Yeah, I want to jump in here too, Amy. I having spent 17 years on a campus in IT and business office, one of the big challenges is IT is inherently in higher ed is inherently decentralized. And some vice president goes to a conference and sees a shiny new thing, and before you know it, they bought that shiny new thing, and then they come to IT and say, oh, we need, no big deal, we can do this. And a week later or a month later, oh, well, we need this data, oh, we need that data. And suddenly, not only do you have all this technical repercussions, but if I put on my data hat, my analytics hat, suddenly you have all this hidden data that's living in this new system, and all the reports from last year don't match this year because the data is in a new place and no one, so then you have to work through that. So this is a snowball rolling down a hill. It's not just the technology. I mean, we're talking about technology today, but the implication is vast and widespread, and it's inherent because higher education tends to be very decentralized, and there's a lot of independence.
Absolutely.
When you add stress to the system, right, it's even harder to see the synergy of team ball, right? Yeah. You think of, like, a basketball analogy would be, the individualists on the team, once they're under stress, they might forget what the coach helped them see about how to play team ball and achieve a better result more easily, right? They default to doing it on their own, and the defense adapts and they shut them down. It's like same kind of concept here. Add stress to the system, like budget pressures, enrollment pressures, all kinds of things, COVID, right? It gets much harder to see that synergy. And that's why we're calling out IT, led by the CIO, and in particular the CFO, as potential champions to help the organization really see this synergy in a way that may not have been evident before, but they feel the symptoms, so they're vulnerable to a good argument. I think we have to bring that argument about, have that discussion. So we're going to pause this dramatic story at Nightingale College. We'll come back to it in a few, but I want to now talk about how we prevent tech debt. So what will prevent it? And I want to start out, and we've alluded to this, and this is hard, but at the end of the day, this is what is a best practice, is how can we take a holistic approach to change, where we have a strategy for the entire institution that drives the prioritization of what we're going to change, processes we're going to add, expansions, markets we're going to go into, Let's say we're expanding our online education while we're continuing to refine our face-to-face education. Maybe we're refining some of our learning methods. Maybe we're going through an ERP change, right? And we're accelerating the way our back end supports via better automation, all of our processes, right? But whatever it is, it's strategy driven, that gets prioritized. We think about it through the lens of architecture, and we work through a standardized development approach where we're not customizing, but we're thinking about how to add capabilities, adopt capabilities that will be on a sustainable whole. So Wayne, does that trigger any insights for you? Is that pure theory? Can this be done? We espouse it a lot. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So this is a big topic. We could probably just do a webinar just on this particular topic, but this is one of the biggest change areas that institutions have to go through, right? Like, let's just pick on strategy. What, as an institution, right? Most institutions create a strategic plan. If you read enough of them, and I will tell you that most of them are read exactly alike, regardless if they're a 2-year institution, a 4-year private, R1, it doesn't matter. They all have very big, ambitious goals. But I think there needs to be a more detailed layer of what is our strategic, strengths, right? What do we want to be really good at? And, obviously the faculty, the programs, the focus around there, that is the root of anyone's strategic advantage. But in particular, right now, most institutions enable every department to embrace, hey, this is our strategic advantage. And, enrollment, financial aid are 2 areas that I see that is rife with a lot of internal power that dictates kind of this necessary customizations in a lot of systems, right? So I think institutions need to step back, really understand what makes sense to kind of outsource, right? Let somebody else who are the experts run the software, and let's take our IT team and really focus, or our institution, and focus on areas that we're going to get bigger bang for the buck. The other is prioritization, right? Right now, with this siloed approach, there is no prioritization. It's whoever yells the loudest, whoever has the biggest budget gets the priorities. And that is, when you look at institutions that have moved forward and have gotten more progressive about, how they approach technology, they've started to centralize this, where, again, it starts with strategy, and then you start to prioritize and I will pretty much tell you that 90+% of IT departments are oversubscribed, right? Meaning that they have too many projects and not enough people in a certain amount of time. And that's has a direct result of prioritization. So if you're not sure if you have a prioritization problem, really do an analysis about the projects that is in the queue, and then how many people that you have in your IT organization, and really start to look at it that way. Architecture, that needs to be a strategic internal ownership, where it's an enterprise architecture where you really understand how all the systems integrate with one another. For those that are in business intelligence and reporting, the architecture is the answer for getting this data out of it, right? But you should be taking a strategic approach to that. And then standardized development. And so one of the things that I'll say about this, again, bringing this kind of back to the technical debt aspect, I come from the ERP world. And one of the biggest areas that we saw that was really frustrating when we were getting products out is institutions that have highly customized their SIS or ERP, and they as a result, because it's so calcified, that they haven't advanced. And so the user experience on this is one where it's like, this system is terrible, it's slow, I can't use it. And ultimately, as an ERP vendor, we know that the latest version addresses all their needs, but they can't upgrade. They can't move over, right? Because it's so calcified. So anyway, the standardized development is something where, you look to make sure from an architecture point of view, whatever customizations you're adding is not going to limit your ability to stay current, because most of these ERP vendors are providing the features and capabilities that you need out of the box. You just may be way behind. And oh, by the way, if it doesn't happen, right, like you don't stay current, what ends up happening is that you trigger a new ERP, right, which takes 3 years, millions of dollars, and a big major challenge around that. So real hard cost there.
Joe, this is Henry. I want to take a slightly different twist on this term holistic, because I think not only is this a strategy approach, this is also a partnership approach. Holistic being the CFO and the CIO. I sat in both chairs. I get this. Some people tease me, did you get more money when you were the CFO? I said, no, I got less because I knew what the problems were. But the reality is CFOs in the last few years, particularly in tight times, have used what somebody recently called me was the peanut butter approach. Spread it over the top, everybody takes a cut. Okay, that's an easy way for a CFO to get out of what their main job is, which is managing resources, managing people, managing facilities, and managing dollars. Okay, but the problem is when that happens, and the CIO has to say, hey, wait a minute, if you're going to cut my budget and I have to go from 4 years to 5 years on desktops, what's the bigger impact here? There's got to be a conversation, because oftentimes the peanut butter approach from the CFO doesn't understand. And that's what today is about. You don't get to the point of, wow, the impact is going to be, we're going to end up spending all kinds of dollars in repair and support and new hard drives and new memory, when we could have just said, okay, we will make the investment, we will spend a little more because in the long run, we'll be better off. So this holistic approach is not just the idea, the planning, the prioritization, it's also the collaboration and the partnership. And that I would say that partnership extends across the president's executive cabinet. They all have to get it. The CFO doesn't own the budget. We own the budget together.
So true.
I'm off my
Here,
soapbox.
Henry.
I'm glad you added that. Like, what that collaboration does is it surfaces the details that are needed to grapple with the trade-offs of how we spend money, how we prioritize. And so it's not just thinking about shiny technology, it's thinking about what will it cost in a variety of forms that we need to consider as possibilities. But if I bring it back to the strategy point, this is what so many people, when they hear strategy, they just think lofty, impractical, because they've had experience, as Wayne articulated, with a strategic plan that was kind of meaningless. But what we're talking about is continuous strategic thinking about strategic choices to be made that can be made in the interest of the institution's primary goals. And it's only under those circumstances, when you're really thinking about what this institution is trying to accomplish at the highest level with its strategy, only then will you tend to have the motivation to accept the trade-offs across that myriad decentralized organizational fabric that we've been talking about. You're selfish until you see the greater cause. The greater cause is only visible in the context of a strategy. And so when you don't see it, because strategy is not being adequately exercised and communicated and adjusted and furnishing that guidepost, then you default to what's good for me, right? And that's what we see. We see a lot of that. So let's keep moving along here. This next one we have is, we love talking about this because it's provocative, right? How do you go slow to speed up? Well, what we mean by that is, if you consider that the fastest way to get to something, we talked about, maybe the fastest way to the feature is going to set you off on a path to buy yet another technology. Well, that's not a good idea. That's ultimately going to slow us down. So in that case, going fast, we're going fast to slow down. Going slow in that situation and evaluating, what are other ways I could get this feature? How bad is it not to have this feature today? How might I have gotten this feature more easily in the past if I'd have made a broader decision and stuck with the vendor's offering versus some customization? All those things come into play here. And you're probably thinking, wow, it must be tough to unbury oneself from a set of bad decisions. Sure, just like that deferred maintenance bill that we talked about, the CFO thinking about, if you've got a lot of deferred maintenance, you got to start prioritizing. How do I break this down? So that is true. But one way to minimize tech debt is to go slow to speed up. Take a little bit more time to find the synergy and fit it into the plan, and perhaps accept a little delay that's associated with that, so that we don't introduce more delay with that change. And in fact, we can be making changes with less and less delay over time. All right, next one is The other thing you can do, and this is what we're ultimately recommending, is you can start to manage your tech debt, right? And what we'll offer a little bit more detail on here as we bring this webinar to a close is thoughts on how to educate your organization on tech debt, how to measure tech debt, and then how to start minimizing tech debt through better decisions. But before we touch on those details, let's go return back to our story where we last left our heroes over at Nightingale College. So Thomas, take it away. Let's talk about some new approaches you've adopted and some new impacts from those approaches.
Sure, thank you. You know, at Nightingale College, we talked a lot about where we were and how we were stuck in the mire a lot of this debt, this tech debt. And so we actually went back and really kind of cleaned the slate. It really came down to the fact that I looked at how much we were spending on technology, and I had a lot of requests coming in because we had been growing as an organization, and it was just like, I see all this money coming in. I see, this software that's going to do scheduling, and this other software that's going to do, an app for the learners and things like that. So I saw a lot of the requests coming in. I'm like, no, we got to do this better. So we sat down and we came up with this approach, and we came up with an IT strategy roadmap. And it really does and falls in very consistently with what we've talked to or been talking about here. In that IT strategy roadmap, it's not just that 1-year plan we always talk about, right? It's a ongoing, forward-looking plan, and it has several things in it. One of them is emergency technology awareness and assessment. Technology changes, and so we need to be aware of what that looks like, what's coming down the pipe, and then that way, as we know, something's kind of, artificial intelligence is something that a lot of people are talking about. We aren't quite ready there, but it's something we know is coming down the pipeline, so we should start getting ready. We have a strategic plan and IT solutions alignment. Like we talked before, or we spoke earlier, many times the strategic plan for the college or university does not have IT really interwoven into it, right? That's where we live. I mean, if you look at what we do, most of the time we're sitting in some type of suite, some type of system. We're doing our work there, and it really needs to align to our strategic plan, and that's what we've done into the future. KPIs that are supported by automation, making sure that our KPIs are produced from the system, and that the system itself follows the processes, things that came through. We have a data governance plan that goes through our source of truth, MDM, and socialization. Socialization is something we really haven't talked too much or spoken about much. We've kind of alluded to it, but it's around culture. One thing that was really difficult for us was being able to take a decentralized culture of looking for their own software solution for their department or for their different function that they did, and really have them understand that IT is an enterprise approach, and that they need to understand that as they look at software, to ask several questions. Do we already have something that does this? Is this something as I do bring it on, are there other features that we can utilize across the organization? And so the socialization of looking at it from an enterprise level was difficult, but something that we were able to get a lot of people on board. Not just the C-suite, not just upper management, but management in and of itself. Wayne mentioned that he had junior managers that would just go and buy software, right? If you can get the junior managers to understand we have a technology roadmap, we have a set of criteria. What is it that you're looking for? Okay, let's set up your criteria. A lot of software people are really good salesmen, right? They're good at selling, but you really need to be able to understand what your requirements are and have the right people in that room. And then minimize customization due to well-vetted product solutions and process alignment. We've talked a lot about that. Make sure that, and what we've done is we've made sure that the software that we're getting aligns to our processes, that we really slow down, like Joe said, and really dial in our plan and say, okay, we're buying this, how long, and we estimate how long we're going to use it for, right? We're like, okay, so this is what we're looking at. How long are we going to use it? What features does it have? Are we going to use some features in the future that we'd want to turn on? And one thing that's really been beneficial is instead of doing the customization by ourselves, we've worked with the vendor and said, look, here's a feature we would like to see. Because if they can build it into their software, then it's a feature that they support. So when they go ahead and upgrade, those are the kind of things that you don't have to worry about breaking. And so that's the solution that we've taken on, and it's been incredible. Our costs are predictable. We know exactly where we need to go. And that goes with labor as well. We're able to dial in on headcount a lot better instead of throwing headcount at the problem. Cost for ongoing maintenance, again, that's lower. We know what it is, and we don't have a lot of customizations we have to keep up with when we have any system upgrades. Strategic goals and KPIs are timely with clean, relevant data, and our technology has become a competitive advantage for us. It's something that we're able to use, and as we venture into producing more data for regulatory bodies, our accreditors, things like that, we are able to not only show them that we're doing a good job at what we say we're going to do, but we're dynamic and quick with it. And so it's been incredible. And again, I talked about the culture shift. When people have software that makes sense, when the processes flow well, you don't have people saying the software is horrible. They don't have a horrible experience in their job. They're like, wow, I like what I'm doing, and the software helps them to be more effective and more efficient. The job is not a drag as much as it would be with tech that's not working. So,
wow, sounds like a pretty holistic result. Thanks so much for sharing that, Thomas. I want to keep moving along here so we save some time for questions here at the end. So this next one is, okay, how can we now enlist support from the entire cabinet and maybe even the board by introducing a KPI? A tech debt as a negative KPI. What does that look like? So to do that, we would need to educate our team, our cabinet and board on what tech debt is. So much like we've done today, articulating, what this thing is and what impact it's having. Then we'd want to start measuring it, right? And the way we would measure it, we suggest the easiest way to get started is for your major new projects and for every existing system, have a retrospective where you're looking at what the costs are of that system and which of those costs are now you'd put in the category of a cost that is going to be paid in the future to make sure to fix something that we have. So back to that parking lot example, right? We lay a parking lot, and let's say we lay it kind of wrong, and we immediately see that, oh wow, there's a couple seams in there that are going to be, we're going to have to fix those at some point. Well, that's already an immediate cost. That'd be an example of rolling out a system perhaps with a customization that's going to be brittle from the very, very start. Okay. So with new projects, start to articulate what are these costs that we've already, set in motion with the new deployment. And on a quarterly basis, let's review all of our existing systems for known tech debt, sources of slowdown that reflect choices we've made or the way that we've gone about buying and implementing and managing that software. If we can start to point to this this negative KPI, I call it negative KPI because it's a downer, it's something you want to minimize, right? Then we can help educate the board and the cabinet to better understand, we may have to take a go slow to get faster approach and be more thoughtful about investments. And then we talk about correlating progress. So if you have tech debt as a KPI that you're able to measure and show how it's changing, you'll be able to relate how it's changing to your behavior. So when you just can't make the case to slow down and someone makes a reflex decision to lay something down that's going to add tech debt, you capture that. When you make the better decision by slowing down to make a better choice that's going to reduce tech debt, you capture that as well. And you can start to correlate your progress making better decisions and having this lower cost of capability because it's not being dragged down by the tech debt. Like Thomas was articulating, at least the qualitative level, I'm sure he has some quantitative mechanisms to be able to identify that. You can look at the plan and point to the plan and say, hey, wow, our budget is now working harder for us. We're throwing fewer people at problems, and we're able to add new capabilities at lower cost, and our running costs are lower. That's where you need to get to.
Hi,
So
Joe.
with that, yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, no, just time check here, and we've got a few good questions from our audience, so want to just make sure we save a few minutes at the end to run through those. We're almost at the hour.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So Wayne, bring us home here with a quick summary and call to action, and then we'll take a couple questions.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So the first step in what you can do about this is you can start to gather the qualitative data on your overall tech impacts, right? And the one thing that I would stress here is that this is not a hunt for finding blame, right? Everybody is in this together, right? So the qualitative aspect is, how do we make decisions, right? The culture is the culture, and it's not one person. It's not one department, right? So I think you approach it in a non-emotional, very, kind of data-centric position, even though it's qualitative. Like, you just want to see how we're making decisions, how priorities are happening. The education, right, of your leadership on technical debt. This is something that just doesn't happen overnight. This is an ongoing learning curve. I would guess that if you start now, even 3 years from now, you're still going to learn more about technical debt, but you'll have a much finer point of really understanding what it is, how you're measuring it, and in particular, how you can move faster, right? You got to pay your technical debt off. That's why it's like go slow to go fast, right? You got to pay that off before you can speed up, right? And then start quantifying it, right? Put a number associated with it. Put it on, other than expand how you're accounting for it today. Other than we're doing a project that has a beginning and an end, and we put a cost associated with that and call it a day. You start to put a longer tail on this, right? Understand and put your own formula. There's a variety of different ways that you could put a formula together to start to measure the different types of technical debt that you would have at your institution. Adjust the decision making to minimize, right? This kind of goes into the strategy, right? Centralizing your priorities, but really making sure everybody understands outside of the IT department how each of their specific requests are going to impact, right? The other way to say this is institutions need to also get better at the human change, right? The process, how people are doing the business, right? It's easier to change the human processes than actual technology. It's cheaper, it's easier. Now, it's something that institutions have to get better at as well, right? The last thing is communicate. Continue to understand that there's a learning curve. No one's to blame. No, this won't be perfect. It's a journey, right? It's something that you take holistically. And, there should be some type of frequency that you're reassessing where you are. If it's just once a year, good, great. Start once a year. I think the healthiest place to do this, you don't need to do it on a monthly basis per se, but you should probably start to do it on a quarterly basis that rolls up into just kind of like, most, financial driven organizations have to report quarterly earnings and things like that. Just kind of getting that type of cadence to get that discipline.
Great. Thanks, Wayne. I think we'll have a little bit of time here for one more question. So, Emily, why don't you pick the best question that we have that's come up?
Great. Yeah, I think this one's a good one. So someone wrote, we are preparing for a large project to replace our ERP system. How should we minimize tech debt produced by this project?
Well, I'll take a first crack. I'm sure others will have something to add, and we'll run a little bit long here for the sake of the recording. So the ERP system touches everything. So it's for sure the most central thing that you could be involved with, and therefore it has the most tentacles and the most opportunities to either create tech debt or minimize tech debt. So I think that's the real key. So when you are embarking on this journey to bring in a new ERP, it's your opportunity to get it way more right the first time, right? It won't be perfect, as Wayne said, but really thinking about architecture, really thinking about connectedness to other systems, really thinking about how you're going to go slow to speed up with that project. There's no project where you could have more ROI on this approach. Anyone want to add to that?
I would just say at all cost, resist we have always done it that way. Now is the time to change the business process and not change, because changing the technology without changing the business process isn't going to gain you a thing. You're going to take all the old problems along with you. You're going to end up having requests for the customizations. You're going to pay for getting rid of them to do this. Don't bring them back. Change the business process.
And Joe, I'll just add to this from a practical point of view. this is a perfect time to really evaluate your current ERP that you're replacing and understand how much technical debt is there. And ultimately, again, the reason why that technical debt is there is probably organizational decision-making over the years. And if you're not careful, right, and this is where there's a high risk, the new shiny object is not a silver bullet for all your problems, right? It is a opportunity to practice good habits. And so if you understand kind of where you are and how you got there, you can start to think about how to avoid it with the new, right, with the new system. And again, especially if you're moving on premise to the cloud, you're going to be more constrained about how much customizations you can do or can't do. And so you're going to need to look at making making change management, the human and processes side, really the area that you focus on.
Well, it's a great point to end on. Wayne, thank you. And thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today. But more importantly, thanks to all of our guests. We really hope that this has served you in terms of helping you identify a major issue in the way that institutions are grappling with technology. We hope that you'll be able to better understand tech debt, better identify it, and better understand what's causing it, and also ultimately work to manage it. If you want to learn more about what we have to offer, we work with institutions on tech debt and other challenges. We also help them with those ERP implementations because there's a lot of ways that you can get that right with a little bit of assistance from an outfit like Hire Digital. Please feel free to visit us at www.hire.digital or send us a note at info@hire.digital. So thanks again for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on another Hire Digital webinar in the future.